Hello, everyone. We'll get started in a minute. I hope you're doing well this very warm Thursday. Of course, always around the high holidays, it's boiling. At least we're all in our own air conditioned homes this year for Yom Kippur. And though I'm building my sukkah tonight, and it's so schwitzy already. I mean, again, a whole week of schwitzy weather here. Definitely have to pray for that rain at the end of Sukkot. Hopefully, everyone had a meaningful Yom Kippur in whatever format that came for you and whomever you were with. I was just speaking with Hannah, who is behind the scenes helping with this, and her father is a cantor. She, of course, works at a synagogue. Her mother sings in the choir at a synagogue. And so we were just talking about how weird when you get into this routine. I mentioned this last week as well, though, this idea of the holidays and the rituals around it and how all of that was changed this year, how to find meaning during the holiday when it doesn't take its usual form. It takes effort, right? It's a different kind of muscle that I know, at least for me, that I had to work on Yom Kippur in order for it to still have a feeling of Yom Kippur. I wore my all white all day as I do on Yom Kippur. Fasting, of course, being very different when I have time to sit, a little bit more so than when I'm on the bima most of the day. So at least I was able to do some teaching in the afternoon, which felt good. Okay, we're going to get started. Again, this is our second to last session together. Crazy. That's our 28th week. Next week will be our 29th, our final week. And again, I just want to put out the invitation for anyone. Maybe I was reflecting after last week's session, this idea that I put out the invitation for someone or anyone to teach for 2 to 3 minutes. And I realized that may feel overwhelming, the idea of teaching. But maybe instead of the word teaching, maybe you could just see it as offering any reflections or lingering questions or anything else that you would want to share with us, those of us who are learning together. There's usually about 20 people on this at least every week. So whether you've come every week, whether you've come just a few times, if you want to take a few minutes next week, please just reach out to me. Or I may use the law school method of literally just calling out on people who I know usually have things to say, and asking them just on the spot to reflect. So maybe be on your toes. I do that with the elementary school children that I teach on a regular basis, and I know sometimes it can be a little overwhelming. But if we're all in this together, it's not me testing you. It's really just wanting other voices, not just my own, to be heard during our time together. So next week will be our final session. I'll probably bring a text, or I'll think about a way to kind of bring all of this together. But I would love your help in bringing it all together as well, because this format class isn't going to exist for a while. The next iteration is going to be slightly different of the classes that we're offering for the fall from the clergy. It's going to be more, there are going to be a few different options available, but we're not going to necessarily have one topic that we're covering on each week from the same person. So it's going to be more of a roundtable opportunity to learn from a variety of people. And if you have other ideas of things that in the future you'd like to learn, please let me know. So again, invitation is out there. I hope some of you will take me up on it and be brave, and I'll invite you onto the screen and you can just share your reflections or anything, any of the texts or concepts that we've covered that you want to take with you, that whatever it may be. Okay, enough about that. Okay, so I brought another text from Ta'anit. I realize we've studied a lot of texts from Ta'anit because there are a lot of great stories in that part of the Talmud. And this one has to do with a certain character named Nahum of Gamzo. And so we're going to read through it. I'm bringing it this week because we just finished Yom Kippur. We're going into Sukkot. We're still supposed to be in the space of deep reflection, even through Simchat Torah, really until the end of when Simchat Torah comes around. And I think there are some concepts in here that at least get me thinking about the deeper way of understanding the world around us. So really, one of the themes that I found in this is this idea that the pain that we inflict on ourselves and the impact of that pain. So we'll see that in the story. There's also the theme of suffering, and is suffering for good? Is it for bad? What's the benefit, if any, of suffering? How are we supposed to understand our own suffering and suffering around us? So with that, let's read through it. Again, as I say every week, you'll have the chat function. You'll be able to virtually raise your hand after we go through this together and offer your own insights or questions. So let's begin with the blessing for engaging in the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praise are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who commands us to engage in the study of Torah. All right, here we go. We'll read through it, and then we'll go back, break it down a little, and then open it up. Okay, from Ta'ani 21a. They said about Nahum of Gamzo that he was blind in both eyes, his 2 hands were cut off, his 2 legs were amputated, and his whole body was full of boils, and he was lying in a dilapidated house with the legs of his bed in bowls of water, so that the ants should not crawl up onto him. One time his disciples wanted to remove his bed and then clear everything out of his house. He said to them, "My children, empty out the furniture and then clear out my bed. For I guarantee you, so long as I am in the house won't fall." So they cleared out the furniture, and afterward they cleared out his bed, and the house fell down. His disciples said to him, "My Lord, now, since you are completely righteous, how did this condition come upon you?" He said to them, "My children, I brought it on myself. For one time I was walking on the way to the house of my father-in-law, and with me I had 3 well-loaded asses, one with food, one with drink, and one with delicacies. A poor man came and stopped me on the way and said to me, 'My Lord, feed me.' I said to him, 'Wait until I unload the donkey.' But I didn't have a moment to unload the donkey before his soul went forth. I went and fell on his face and said, 'My eyes, which did not take pity on your eyes, let them be blind. My hands, which had no pity on your hands, let them be cut off. My feet, that did not have pity on your feet, let them be cut off.' And I did not calm down until I had said, 'Let my whole body be covered with boils.' They said to him, 'Woe is us that we have seen you in such straits.' He said to them, 'Woe would it have been for me had you not seen me in such straits.'" And why did they call him Nahum of Gamzo? Because whatever happened to him, he would say, "This too is for the good," in Hebrew, Gamzo L'Tova. Once the Israelites wanted to send a gift to the household of Caesar. They said, "Who will go? Let Nahum of Gamzo go, because he is experienced in miracles." They sent along a chest full of precious stones and pearls, and he went. At night he came to a certain inn. During the night, the guests in the inn went and took all the precious stones and pearls from the chest and filled it up with dirt. The next day when he saw it, he said, "This too is for the good." When he got to the ruler's palace, they opened the chest and found it was full of dirt. The king wanted to kill all of them. He said, "The Jews are ridiculing me." Nahum of Gamzo said, "This too is for the good." Elijah came along and appeared in the form of one of them, the Romans. He said to the king, "Perhaps this dirt comes from the dirt of Abraham, their father. For when he threw dirt against the enemy, it turned into swords, and when he drew stubble, it turned into arrows." As quote, "His sword makes them as dust, his bow as the driven stubble," from Isaiah. Now there was a certain city that the Romans had been unable to conquer. They tried it out by using the dirt and conquered it. They took Nahum of Gamzo to the treasury and filled his chest with precious stones and pearls and sent him away with great marks of honor. When he was going home, he stopped again for the night at the same inn and was asked, "What did you bring with you that they paid you such great honor?" He said to them, "What I took from here, I brought there." Thinking the dirt under the inn to be miraculous, they tore down their inn and brought the rubble to the household of the king. They said to him, "The dirt that was brought here was ours." They tried it out and found there was nothing to it. They executed those innkeepers. End of story. Okay. Fascinating story, right? And it's really almost 2 stories in one. We have part 1, which explains Nahum of Gamzo in his current state, and then we have the second story, which really we could probably see as a precursor to the first story, where obviously because he could walk and he had the ability to go on this trip. And we get a sense of his name and the understanding of his name and why he was called what he was called. And Nahum means comfort. This idea of Nachamu is comfort me. So we have this concept of this character, two parts, one in which he has this self-inflicting perspective on how he needs to respond to his own failings. And in the second part, we have two concepts. One, this idea of what does it mean to have a name and a kind of a worldview in which this too is for the good, and what are the challenges and benefits of that worldview. And then we also have the impact of those who are not as honorable as Nahum of Gamzo, and the impact that their ending, what happens to people who act like those in the inn versus people like Nahum of Gamzo. Okay, so let's go back and read it again, and then we'll open it up to your thoughts. But again, this idea of, in the first part, this self-inflicted pain. And why does he do this? Does he do this out of guilt? Does he do this from a desire to please someone else? Does he do this to remember? And what is the idea of how the pain that we inflict on our own lives and for ourselves? Thinking about yourself. When I think about myself, what have been those moments where I've inflicted more pain on myself? Of course, not physically necessarily, but more internally and psychologically and emotionally. What have been those moments? Is there a theme to the ways in which you inflict pain on yourself? And why do you do that? Are there actual benefits to that? Because according to this story, there seems to be some benefit, or maybe not. Is this a story to suggest that this self-inflicting approach to seeing the suffering of others, and if we fall short, that we must inflict pain on ourselves? Is that the lesson that we're supposed to uphold, or is this trying to teach us that is not the way to do it? So let's go through it and see what you think. Okay, back to the beginning of the story. Now, another reason I liked this story is because already in the very beginning, I think of Unatana Tokef. And I think of Unatana Tokef because if you remember, maybe you don't know this, or maybe you know the story of the Rabbi Amnon, which is kind of the, excuse me, for some reason out of breath, which is the story that's usually used to explain the genesis of the Unatana Tokef prayer. And I'm not going to do the whole thing, but the basic summary is, there's a rabbi who has a relationship with a foreign leader. The foreign leader asks him to convert to Christianity, and Rabbi Amnon says, "No, let me just sleep on it." And then as soon as he leaves, he realizes, how did he even leave an opening for the suggestion that he would potentially convert out of Judaism? And so he feels terrible about that. He has this guilt. And he does not go after 3 days back to the king, and the king sends for him. And as a result, finally, in the end, his tongue is cut out, his fingers and his toes are cut off. He's tortured, but he's still alive. And he's tortured for not following through, for not returning to the king when he was commanded, for not converting. And he goes on the high holidays to the synagogue, and he offers the Unatana Tokef prayer. So that's kind of the Genesis story for Unatana Tokef. You can look it up and read it in more detail. But for me, the whole idea of Nahum of Gamzo also has this idea of these self-inflicted wounds. Now, of course, the story of Rabbi Amnon, it's inflicted by others, but really because of his own actions and how he decides to go about presenting himself to the king. But here we have something along those lines of this painful suffering that in some ways is self-inflicted. So they said about Nahum of Gamza that he was blind in both eyes. His 2 hands were cut off, his 2 legs were amputated, and his whole body was full of boils, and he was lying in a dilapidated house with the legs of his bed in bowls of water so that the ants should not crawl up onto him. Okay, not a positive image at all of this man. We imagine, it's even hard to imagine what this would look like, but it is not a supportive or comforting or peaceful image that we have of this man whose literally name is compassion and comfort. And so one time his disciples wanted to remove his bed and then clear everything out of the house. We could imagine why, of course, because he's living in this dilapidated house with the ants potentially crawling up onto him. It's horror movie-like. He said to them, "My children, empty out the furniture and then clear out my bed, for I guarantee you, so long as I am in the house won't fall." There's something about, he recognizes that because of his actions or because of his state of being, that he has a power to make sure that the house doesn't fall. Now, we can read this, of course, just as the physical house, or we can see that he is seeing himself as a representation of keeping things intact, even though he himself is not intact, even though he is truly a mess of a character physically. There is something about that almost, that it's about his suffering that allows him to hold the house up. So I think already we have a teaching here. What is the idea that our suffering can actually be something that upholds us, gives us strength? Because that seems to be one of the things that Nahum lives by, that all the things that have been taken away from him, all the pain and suffering that he has gone through, has somehow allowed him to uphold his home and the place that he dwells in a way that as soon as he's removed, everything else around him will fall. And that's exactly what happens. They clear out the furniture, and afterwards they cleared out his bed and the house fell down. Then they say, well, how, since you are completely righteous, you clearly are an incredible rabbi and teacher, and how did this come upon you? How would you have gone through such suffering when you are such a good person? Right? And already this is a question that comes up a lot when we think about the ways in which, and if you remember Harold Kushner's book, it's not why, if I remember correctly, it's not why do bad things happen to good people. It's when bad things happen to good people. And so there are bad things that are going to happen to good people, no matter what. So here, they want to know, okay, something must have happened. You're such a good person. Someone must have inflicted such pain on you, and yet still you have been able to maintain your composure and to remain a righteous person. How did you do that? Well, he says, I brought it on myself, which of course is already, if we hadn't read through this before, you're taken aback by who would do this to oneself, who would cause such pain and take away so much to themselves. For one time, he says, I was walking on the way to the house of my father-in-law, and with me I had these donkeys, one with food and one with drink and one with delicacies. I had everything I needed and more. And a poor man came and stopped me on his way and said to me, my lord, feed me. And I said, well, wait until I unload the donkey. But I didn't have a moment to unload the donkey before his soul went forth. So first, this idea, I brought it upon myself. Again, this goes back to that theme that I mentioned before, the self-inflicting wounds that we bring upon ourselves. He admits right here that the suffering that he has gone through and the pain was self-inflicted. So again, I think we're supposed to be thinking about what are the ways in which we inflict pain on ourselves. Then, because he didn't take that exact moment when someone was asking for help, when he didn't jump on that, as a result, this man dies because he had the opportunity to save this man or help him in some way, but he didn't act quickly enough, and as a result, the man dies, and that leads him to go through this process of inflicting such pain on himself. But I think before we even get to how he inflicts this pain, this idea that I didn't have a moment to unload the donkey before his soul went forth, the impact of one moment that this story seems to be teaching us about, that the impact of one interaction with someone, whether we know that person well or whether we don't know that person at all, there is a profound and sometimes, according to this story, a life and death action and reaction that comes for the interactions that we have with other people. For me, this is a story not just about taking care of the poor and the need for us to immediately do everything in our power to help those who are vulnerable and weak and those who don't have the resources that we have in the world around, that that we have some responsibility. But on a more interpersonal level, it's the idea that here we are reminded that the slightest of interactions we have with someone else matters. They matter dramatically. I think about Martin Buber and the idea of I, thou versus I, it, the two types of relationships that we have with other people. Most of our relationships are I, it, where we see the other more as an object, But I, thou is the way in which we can really connect with someone and where God dwells within that relationship. That whether it's the person at the grocery store, the person delivering our food to our home, whatever it may be, that the smallest of interactions can have a profound impact that we're not even aware of. But we should be aware that our interactions are significant. All of our interactions are significant. And so I think we were looking into the new year. How can you make sure that you look at the interactions that you have with friend and stranger alike? And how could you imagine each of those interactions to be significant? For example, when I walk my dog, I try to say hello to everyone who I see on the street. And sometimes I'll chat with someone from afar if they have another dog or whatever it may be. But I even see that in the walks that I take in my neighborhood, that I have a responsibility to try and engage with the world around me. Now, of course, sometimes I'm listening to a podcast or music, so I'm in my own world. But when there's the opportunity to engage with other people, I think our tradition is suggesting that we have a responsibility to try and engage as much as we can. So he goes and he falls on his face and he says, my eyes, which did not take pity on your eyes. He's looking now at this man who died. My eyes, which did not take pity on your eyes, let them be blind. My hands, which had no pity on your hands, let them be cut off. My feet, that did not have pity on your feet, let them be cut off. And I did not calm down until I had said, let my whole body be covered with boils. So he goes to the extreme, right? It's not just a couple al-chetz on his chest at Yom Kippur. Here he goes to an extraordinary extreme to punish himself because of what he was unable to do. Now, of course, no one else probably would ever do this, and of course it's a story, but this seems to be taken as an example of the impact that we have. Again, I just talked about this, but how we are supposed to imagine, if we're not physically going to do these things to ourselves, what does it mean for us to be suffering inside, or to do some self-inflicted punishment for our sins and for our inability to care for those who are in need. They said to him, woe is us that we have seen you in such straits. Okay, this is them saying, we feel so bad for you. I mean, it's horrible for us to see you in this state. We have pity on you. Okay, and imagine any of us who have been in that situation where we've undergone some challenging time and others are empathetic or have pity on us, and express that and say, I feel so badly for you, right? And there are a few ways in which we can respond to that. And according to Nahum, he says, woe would it be for me had you not seen me in such straits. In fact, the whole purpose is for you to see me this way, not for me to hide my suffering, not for me to hide my flaws, but instead for them to be an example to you. Right? So this is taking the pity that may be brought upon us, or the empathy even that is brought upon us by others when they see us suffering. And here he's saying, no, I want you to see my suffering not as something that is a detriment to who I am, but I want you to see my suffering as exactly a representative of who I am and my identity. And how true that is, but how often we seem to kind of put our own suffering on the back burner or hide it because it's private, it's not for anyone else. And yet Nahum of Gamzo is saying that if we could somehow represent the suffering that we've gone through in a way that doesn't necessarily encourage pity, but instead encourages others to recognize how they should act in the world and how they can learn from us, that it's almost as if, can we teach other people through the suffering that we have endured? And that according to this, we almost have a responsibility to wear it literally on our sleeves, right? And we don't do that very often. And usually we look down on people who are Debbie Downers, so to speak, or those who choose only to focus on the negative. But this is about taking the negative things that have happened and somehow turning them into something else, which is, of course, not easy to do. But here Nahum serves as the example for that. So now we move on to this second part of the story, which is, why did they call him this? Why is this his name? Nahum of Gamzo, because whatever happened to him, he would say, this too is for the good. Okay, so already now we have this really interesting idea of Is that how you see the world? This is the question I'm asking you to reflect on here. Do you walk through the world saying that this too is for the good? Because it's not just the good things that we're supposed to see and say, this is representative of the world in which I want to live in. We're supposed to see all the negative things that are happening and somehow see that this too is for the good. At least that's according to this story. So what comes to mind? COVID, economic downturn, the political world in which we're living, having just watched that debate with my daughters the other night. And so all of these things, are you able to respond to all of those things and say this too is for the good? Not necessarily. And it's not really clear if this story is telling us that we should do that or not. But it is something to think about. Again, in this idea of how do we take negativity and somehow, redirect how we're supposed to respond to that negativity. So once the Israelites, and this is the story to kind of represent why he's named this way. Once the Israelites wanted to send a gift to the household of Caesar, and they said, who will go? And let Nahum of Gamzo go, because he's experienced in miracles. So they sent along a chest of precious stones and pearls, and he went. And at night he came to a certain inn, and during the night the guests in the inn went and took all the precious stones and pearls from the chest and filled it up with dirt. And the next day when he saw it, he said, this too is for the good. So he goes to an inn, and while he's sleeping, and actually, I know I said earlier that maybe this is out of order in his life, but maybe this does come after he's gone through all of that pain from above. And so he goes and they steal from him, and they replace what he's taking to the Caesar with dirt. Now you can imagine already, and we've read the story, but you can imagine if you're going to go bring gifts to the Caesar, if you're bringing a chest full of dirt, you're not going to be received very well. But yet, when he is faced with this, when he has been set on a path with a certain goal, and people come along and they destroy that plan. And as we all know, there are people and opportunities and experiences that come into our life where we have a plan, we have a set pathway to reach a certain goal, and then something comes along and brings it off its rails. Here, something just like that happens, but what does he do? He said, this too is for the good. Okay? Now, I feel like interesting. How is it possible that he can see that this is for the good? So let's keep going. When he got to the ruler's palace, they opened the chest and found it was full of dirt, and the king wanted to kill all of them. He said, the Jews are ridiculing me. Of course he would say that. It's completely offensive that he comes with this chest just of dirt as opposed to the precious stones and jewels that we're supposed to. And again, Nahum of Gamzo said, this too is for the good. Now, this to me is the most troubling of the lines, this little exchange here. It makes me think about our own history as Jews. And somehow I have a real trouble with this. So if anyone can maybe help me through this part, I would love to know how. But this idea that the king wanted to kill all of them because he felt disrespected. And Nahum says this too is for the good. Now, how can that be when there is clear articulation of a desire for someone to destroy you, that you can say this too is for the good? Is that because you have a sense of faith that goes beyond this world? Is it because at a certain point our suffering automatically transforms into something else where we can see things in a different way, that his perspective is shifted because of all the things that he's already gone through in his life, that where we focus on in a specific moment in time, whereas the king is saying this, that he is looking at the bigger picture and realizes that maybe it's impossible for the king to kill all the Jews, or that instead of us reacting immediately to something, we need to take a step back and just breathe for a minute to see what actually is going to come next before we just, jump to conclusions. I don't know. Those are a few different ways we can try and understand what's going on here. And I think also try and understand what are we supposed to be learning from this, because I don't think we're supposed to be learning from this that, well, anytime people want to come and kill the Jews, we should say this too is for the good, right? So to me, that's not the lesson that this story is trying to teach us. It has to be something else. And I think it has to be something more on the internal level, not about necessarily how we're supposed to see the politics of the world around us and how we're supposed to respond to that. I don't know, but I'll be curious your thoughts. So Elijah came. We know Elijah the prophet. He comes at Passover. He comes at a bris. He came along and appeared in the form of one of the Romans. And he said to the king, "Perhaps this dirt comes from the dirt of Abraham their father. For when he threw dirt against the enemy, it turned into swords. And when he drew stubble, it turned into arrows. According to Isaiah, his sword makes them as dust, his bow as the driven stubble." By the way, stubble is not stubble on my face. It's really a different type of stubble. I just wanted to show you the picture so you understand exactly what stubble is. Stubble is the wheat after wheat has been cleared and harvested on the field. This is kind of what's left over, right? That harsh, if you've ever been in a wheat field, when the wheat starts to dry and it's just sitting there, and it can be really tough. I mean, it can be pointy. It can hurt you. So that's what it's referring to in terms of the stubble in this story. So maybe, according to Elijah, who's now performing this miracle by saying, oh, maybe there is something about this dirt. Maybe this dirt isn't just ordinary dirt, which I think, again, is a lesson that we're supposed to see, that things that we are presented with in our life that may seem just like ordinary dirt, something that is insignificant, something that may dirty our plans, may just be more of a nuisance than anything else, actually potentially could turn into something else. That maybe underneath that dirt, there is something that can grow from that dirt. So here we have this idea that, well, maybe use this dirt because it's special dirt, and maybe it's part of this very special dirt that somehow turns into swords and arrows. Now, there was a certain city that the Romans had been unable to conquer, so they tried using this dirt and they conquered it. So this dirt was magical. It helped them to overcome this city. And so they took Nahum of Gamzo to the treasury and they filled that chest that he had brought with dirt. They filled it with precious stones and pearls and sent him away with great marks of honor. Okay. When he was going home, he stopped again for the night at the same inn and was asked, "What did you bring with you that they paid you such great honor?" Remember, this is the same inn where the people stole from him. So now they want to know, how is it that we switched out all those precious stones and pearls and gave him dirt, and somehow he came back with more precious stones and pearls? That doesn't seem to be the way the world works. The world doesn't work that way usually, right? So what happens when you expect something to go a certain way, when you expect certain pain on someone else, when in fact it doesn't happen that way, or somehow the world doesn't act the way you expect it to act? And he said to them, "What I took from here, I brought there." So he's saying there was something about what I got from here, the dirt that was filled up in my chest, I brought there, and that was it. But I think, of course, there's probably a deeper level of what does it mean, what I took from here, I brought there. Is it his perspective on the world? Not just the dirt itself, not just the physical dirt, but what else is he bringing with him from here to there, right? And again, it's about what are we taking? He literally brought the dirt, right? Something that is nothing really and commonplace. He brought that with him to another place, and it was transformed into those precious stones and pearls that he was honored with. What does it mean for us to take the dirt, take it with us, bring it somewhere, bring it through our life experience? Can that be transformed into pearls and precious stones? Is that possible? Thinking that the dirt was miraculous, they tore down their inn and they brought the rubble to the house of the household to the king. Because now they want to try this. They think, if I can turn dirt into precious stones, let's take all the dirt from here. And they said, the dirt that was brought here was ours. We were the ones responsible for that dirt that Nahum of Gamzo brought. So give us our due. And they tried it out and found there was nothing to it. So they executed those innkeepers. End of story. Okay, fascinating story. And again, I'm really curious what people think about this idea. This too is for the good. Can you see the world that way? If you do see the world that way, please tell us how you maintain that approach to the world, especially as we saw with Nahum of Gamzo, the fact that not only what happened to him personally, was the self-inflicted, but this idea that he was put in these positions that are very dangerous and scary. And let's be honest, we are living in a very scary and dangerous time. We have the pandemic, which has the potential to harm us physically. And then we have this political system that we're dealing with in this country that has the potential to harm us for decades and generations to come. And so we have all kinds of dangers around us right now, overwhelming amounts, right? And then if you want to throw on top of that the environmental impacts that we've been dealing with, I mean, so and economic, everything seems to be the worst year ever. Is it possible, or are you able to say this too is for the good? I definitely have a hard time doing that at times. But what does it mean? How would it change us if we were to say this too is for the good? And so I think we're also getting hints here of this concept of hope that is so ingrained into the Jewish experience, and this idea of memory and history playing a role in helping us understand how we can take the dirt of the world as it exists and somehow create a larger context to it, and somehow figure out a way to move through it and to find a different path. So let's get to it. Susan, start us off, please.
Can you hear?
Yes.
So just responding to this too is for the good sounds like Voltaire took it from Nahum in Candido. Voltaire was known as an anti-Semite. So that might be some play on it. But I think we can look at it in this way. One is just being Pollyanna-ish and like Candide. But we can reframe negativity. And I think, and reframe what is negative in the world. And faith does that. It's a mindset. That might be also how to view this, how to respond to it, and how can we learn from it. And that's what I'm also seeing is COVID and our political situation, which is highly negative. But then the question is what we can learn from it. What underlying silver linings can we find in it that might embolden a positive response in the future? So I also think it's to degree. You know, the Holocaust is, of course, the worst. And then, you know, it would be awful to say this too is for the good. But Israel came out of was a result of it, and probably we wouldn't have the state of Israel had it not been. Now that's too much of a sacrifice. So, but there was something. If you think of something good happening.
Great. Thank you, Susan. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Self-flagellation here, which I think poor Nahum, he didn't respond in that moment, but instead of contributing to welfare of poor Jews and others, he inflicted this awful thing on himself. And I see that as such a negative. Instead of looking at what he did wrong, was how could he do right in the future? And I see the self-flagellation. I mean, it's a Catholic response. It's obviously built into the human psyche, but reframing again. I didn't do this, so how can I make things better for other people rather than torturing myself, which does, I think, no good, even if he shows his disciples that he's in that position.
Great. Thank you very much, Susan. Yes, just on your point about faith, it's not something we tend to talk about enough, I think, in our tradition, this idea of faith and the role faith can play in helping strengthen our reserves, help strengthen the way in which we can walk through the world, help us understand a greater context. So I urge all of us, as we should all the time, but in this year and especially in this climate, what role does faith play? And if your answer is, I don't really know, then I think it's a question that you should be spending some time reflecting on. How are you defining faith? What does faith look like? How can you create your own definition so you don't get caught up in maybe what is stereotypically understood as faith? Because the stereotypical definition and understanding of faith is probably not going to be true when it really comes down to it, of how faith plays out in our lives. So really, I think this story definitely hits on that and encourages us to think about the role of faith. Thank you, Susan. Hi, Jess.
Hi. I love this story so much. And I was wondering if it's okay if I say two things about it.
Of course.
The first thing was about this idea of this too is for the good. It reminded me of the Joseph story and this idea of these terrible things happening, but ultimately leads to Joseph having great success in his life. And whether it is to be critical of his brothers and to be angry at them for wanting to kill him is actually against God's plan and problematic. And so I was reminded of that as an idea. But more, I mean, all the kind of wild things that happened in the story, what I thought was really fascinating to me was this idea of, and also in the story that you used as a reference about waiting 3 days, about thinking about whether to convert or not, was this idea of not doing something bad, but doing something, the problem was how long you waited. And so in that story, it's 3 days, or even saying, why would I even say 3 days? And in this story, it's a moment. He was going to do something nice. He was going to feed him. He was going to he was going to do something that was good, but his punishment was for taking too long. And I just find that a sort of strange idea. And I was curious in terms of that, if that's sort of a Jewish concept of time that I'm not quite familiar with.
Yeah, I'm so glad you pointed that out, Jess, because you're right. You're supposed to jump on the opportunity in our tradition to do a mitzvah, and you're not supposed to wait around, right? That you're right. This is about, if you have the opportunity to do something good in the world, don't wait. Don't even wait a second, right? Just jump in and do it right away, because if you don't, the world may become a different place. It maybe won't be as enhanced as if you were to take action right away. So there is a concept in our tradition of when you are presented with the opportunity to do a mitzvah, to fulfill a commandment, to do something that is true to our values, then you got to do it right away. And that on top of that, the idea of hidur mitzvah, of beautifying the mitzvot. So not only are you supposed to do something as quickly as you can to really fulfill that, but you should do it in a way that is, you should elaborate it as much as possible. It's not enough. It is enough, but we are encouraged to even go beyond just following the letter of the law, so to speak, and to add decorum to it. Remember the story we talked about with the crowns on the letters of the Hebrew letters in the Torah, right? Those aren't necessary. We don't need to have in a Torah the crowns and the beautifying of the letters themselves. We could just have straight block letters. But there is this idea that by enhancing those letters, we are enhancing the way in which we understand the Torah, the way in which we read it, the visual outline of what it means to actually engage in reading the Torah. So I think there are these many examples in our tradition that suggest that time is of the essence, right? We think about time in our tradition. We are obsessed with time, times of day, times of month, times of year, right? The holiday cycle, all of these things are really significant, and that in one split second, you have the opportunity to change the world. And you can change it for good, or you can miss an opportunity. And we're not supposed to miss our opportunities. We're supposed to take advantage of the time that we have. And I think that ties into this idea of faith also, that if we have faith that we matter, that we have power in this world, and at the same time we are but dust and ashes, then we have a responsibility to act as much as possible to beautify this world, to bring forth what we have to offer. So thank you very much, Jess. That was great. Good point. Anyone else have any other points, comments, questions? Let me see if there's anything in the chat. No Q&A. Let me see here. Okay. Anonymous person said, this too is for the good can mean that you can learn from your experiences, good and bad. Reframing your experiences is the way you can go forward in a positive way. You can take the lessons of these experiences to give purpose to your life and the lives of those around you who see how you live. Great. Thank you, Anonymous. I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing that. Great insight. All right. Now we have some more people. Merle. Hi, Merle.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
I think where I mean, I'm going all over the place with this story, but I'm thinking to the theory of faith. I think what we can do with our faith is teach others what we know is good, whether it's whether it's doing mitzvot, whether it's lashon hara, which a lot of that is going on now, whether no matter what it is. I think that if we understand what the prayers, Talmud, Torah, everything is saying to us as a way of life, then I think hopefully we can get through to someone the right values. And I think that's where our faith comes in.
Great.
Is teaching values in one way or another.
Wonderful. I love that, Merle, because what you're suggesting is faith is not just a personal thing that we're supposed to keep for ourselves and reflect on individually in our own space. Faith, in order for it to be long lasting, for it to really live in our lives, it requires us articulating that faith and sharing it with other people. And we may be nervous to do that, but if we can show, and if by the actions that we take, we can say that those are examples of us acting out our faith, then we are deepening not only our faith, but we're helping others to maybe access their own understanding and definition of faith. So thank you very much. Appreciate that. David. Hi, David.
Thank you. Very true. It's a big question of suffering, which is.
You keep breaking up, David.
Oh, can you hear me at all? Or?
Yep, that's better.
Okay. To me, this question of suffering that this brings up, and how you can say, "Oh, this is for the good," when things go wrong. It seems that's a very big challenge. I mean, if he sees like the fate of the world is in his hands with the jewels, and now it's dirt, but he sees it as good. That's interesting. But like, how are you able to see what looks like a stressful or difficult challenge that the whole Jewish people is in that? I mean, it looks like a big responsibility he's been given, and yet he sees that it's for the good when things seem to completely wrong. And also the question is, why would he take upon himself such suffering, even if he does have a certain degree of guilt by not acting quick enough? And why would it seems that that it was the right thing for him to suffer? Like God gives him the suffering, and he's happy for the suffering. Why would the suffering be considered some kind of appeasement to God, or or atonement for a bad deed? Or why is the suffering looked at by him, at least, as a positive when his followers see this is just terrible? Why would a righteous person suffer, and yet he is really suffering and not looking at it as bad? Are we supposed to see suffering then as a positive thing in the world? I don't know. I'm trying to figure this one out.
Yeah, no, you raise really good points and good questions, because it is not easy. To your second point first, I think at least one of the things that stands out to me is that as he says to his students when they say, "My God, why did this happen to you?" He says, I want to show you my suffering. You learn from my suffering. So I think one of the lessons that it's trying to teach us is that if you can share the teachings of your suffering with other people, then it's not for naught. That there is value in the suffering if it can be transformed into an opportunity to change other people, influence them, allow them to not necessarily go down the same path, right? Because what an intense story to be told if you were a student. Be like, oh my God, well, I'm not going to wait another second. Next time, if someone I look up to and care deeply about and learn from on a regular basis does that to themselves because they don't jump at the opportunity to help another person, God, I'm going to remember that story for a long time, and I'm going to make sure that I jump on that as quickly as possible. So I think maybe one of the lessons we can see is that this idea that self-inflicted, I'm still caught on the self-inflicted part, but the idea of our suffering being a teaching tool, I think seems to be part resonating in the story. The other part about how is it possible to go through and see this too is for the good. I think one thing that I'm trying to, because I struggle with this as well, of course, as many of us do, is is the idea that, well, can we look at how we've dealt with suffering and survived our past challenges in our life? What were the strategies we used? And actually, Rabbi Leder has talked about this. What are the things that we have gone through before, and how can they be a guide for how we can get through the current challenges we're facing? And we can look at that both on an individual level. How am I responding to this pandemic and being isolated at home? What other points in my life have I felt alone? How did I get through that? What were the keys in which that helped me to feel as though I'm not as isolated as I am? And so can you then use those same tools again today? On a more collective level, what are the times in which our society or a group of people, such as the Jews, have gone through significant challenges? What are the ways which we got through that? How were communities brought together, and how did they use power and voice in order to bring about change to end whatever suffering was happening? So I think maybe one of the ways, and it's not the only way, and everyone of course has their own strategy, but one of the ways that I'm trying to understand this, and also how I'm trying to understand the world in which we're living right now, is what are the cues and the hints that I can find from my own life, but also from history, to try and guide me so that we can get to a better place. So those are just a few thoughts, David, but you're right. I think you're bringing up really significant challenges. Go to Jeff, then Claudia, and then I'll come back to you, Susan, after that. So hi, Jeff. Go ahead.
Oh, there we go. I'm going to give you a totally different outlook here, and I'm sure that's not unexpected of me.
I would expect nothing less.
There you go. The idea for me is that Nachum represents a truly different type of individual who, using the three losses, his eyes, his hands, and his feet, is in essence stripping man of the idols that we run after, see, and travel to, or crave and desire in our lives. And what are we left with? In Nachum's case, we are left with unreserved faith in the reasons that this occurred. He doesn't lament. He doesn't blame it on God for doing it to him. And if we look at the end of the story, we represent dirt from the very beginning. And Nachum, in his ability, somehow through his faith, to even draw out Elijah to help him survive the onslaught of the dirt and create a story for him. He's unreservedly faithful, and he's been ultimately rewarded in this. And it's almost as if he reaches a point that no one else can attain. No other story represents faith to that level of an ability to draw forth continued goodness out of the errors and evils and idols that we follow in our life, from gold and pearls and riches. That the significance is our union with God has been through the dirt to arise at faith. So it's a very strange way to arrive at a faith of that degree, to be able to live in harmony with it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jeff. And to add to your point, I think even his name, Nachum, this idea of comfort, his ultimate faith is a complete source of comfort no matter what comes his way. No matter what kind of suffering he endures, his faith serves as a sense of comfort that allows him to get through all of these things. So, Jeff, as always, thank you. Claudia. Hi, Claudia.
Hi, Rabbi. Loved what Jeff said. Wonderful comment. There's so much in this story. We could sit here and talk about it until the cows come home. But there's one thing that troubles me, and it's this self-infliction of pain. by self-inflicting that pain, it's not just about him, but it's about the people around him who had to live with that pain and help him on a day-to-day basis. So there's an element of selfishness that we didn't talk about, but that struck me.
Absolutely.
And
Yes.
and I'm not sure how I want to link this to what Jeff said, but sometimes people of extreme faith tend to have a selfish streak as well. I'm not sure. This just came to me, so I'm not probably verbalizing it correctly. You can do a better job if you understand what I'm trying to say. But that's also what struck me as Jeff was talking.
Great. Thank you, Claudia. Yeah. Excellent points. And I don't know if I'm going to try and get into the selfishness of the faithful right now, but it's an interesting point that I want to sit with and reflect on a little as well. And you're right. This idea, this self-inflicted pain goes beyond ourselves. And we have to remember that, because we do inflict pain upon ourselves. And we have to remember that that self-inflicted pain doesn't just sit with us. It doesn't stay just with us. That pain is felt by others around us. And so self-inflicted pain is selfish in a way. And so how can we be aware that if we are going to do self-inflicted pain, and in the course, in the case of Nahum, it's as if he tries in order to shift it away from selfishness by using it as a teaching tool. That's, I think, would be his answer. My self-inflicted pain was done in order to help others not bring about more pain to their own lives or the world. But if he had only sat with the self-inflicted pain and said, yep, this is what happens when you don't do the right thing, that it doesn't go far enough. But really, thank you for bringing that up, Claudia. Susan, you have the last word today.
Okay, so I was thinking the same thing too. I mentioned it before with self-flagellation. It doesn't help others. I thought it was very disturbing. And there's another concept in Judaism that your body belongs to God. It's a gift from God. So who is he? And you're supposed to honor it and take care of it. Eat correctly, don't smoke and exercise. Don't do bungee diving, which suggests your disbelief in God, or a belief that you're going to come through it. And he desecrates his body. And I find there are two different Nahums here. That is one of them. And yes, that's one. And then also relative to that is that it doesn't, when someone treats oneself negatively, impacts those around him, people in the family, people who hold the negativity and guilt often are not very nice to people in their family, and it affects them as well. The other thing is miracles. When you asked about that, this is a smaller thing. How could Nahum say it was okay? This too is for the good, that the king wants to kill all of them. Well, in the paragraph before that, they said, let Nahum go because he is experienced in miracles. And I thought, where did that come from? But maybe that's because he says this too is for the good. He's known for miracles, and in the next paragraphs that Elijah comes, which is a miracle.
Nice, thank you, Susan. We're gonna have to end, but I apologize for the people who put in the Q&A that I missed some of these. So I just want to read them out loud here. Pamela says he seems very passive, pretty passive, after not acting in time to feed the person who needed feeding. He really does nothing else except suffer and say it is for the good. Can you relate this to Job for us? Sorry, I didn't see this earlier, Pamela. So maybe next week. This too is for the good, says Steve, may lead to a good and then a bad situation, e.g. Joseph's tribulations led to our success in Egypt, but then our success in Egypt led to 400 years of slavery, and that led to Sinai, and that led to the golden calf, and that led to the episode of the spies, and so forth. Good point. And then Rosalie, hi Rosalie, a rabbinic extension of Oedipus. Great questions, amazing comments. I'm sorry we don't have time to go more into this story. But thank you again for finding all the depths and all the treasures in this story today. Again, next week's our last class. Please reach out to me, Rabbi Joel at WBTLA, if you'd like to share a couple of insights in our last session. And look forward to seeing you for our final session next week. Wishing you a Chag Sameach as we start Sukkot tomorrow night. So I hope you have a meaningful Sukkot as well. And even if we can't bring in all of the guests that we would normally bring into our Sukkah, we have the concept of Ushpizine, which is the idea of the mystical creatures and people who could come into our Sukkah and be with us, whether those are people from your own life and your own past, whether those are people from our tradition. So even if you can't have real people in your Sukkah this year, or maybe you don't even build a Sukkah, but if you want to think about the people we can surround ourselves with as we enter into this holiday, maybe that too can help us find the good. Thank you all, and an early Shabbat Shalom. Bye.